Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving deep into a claim that, well, it fundamentally shifts how we think about the very foundation of knowledge.
Especially when that knowledge is about the human mind.
Exactly. The big central question here, the one driving our source material from Jaime Hoerricks, is really simple. What truly counts as knowing the mind?
And for many of us, when we first bump into this field epistemology, the study of how we know things, it's usually laid out as a set of options, a clear choice.
Right. It's often framed like one of those accessible personality quizzes you see online. It sorts your intellectual stance into these neat little boxes.
Mm-hmm.
Are you a universalist, believing in one single objective truth? Or maybe you're a pluralist, you accept multiple truths can coexist. Or maybe you're a full-on relativist, arguing all knowledge is subjective.
And the Hoerricks essay, which builds on some really key works from Jacobson and also Sting, it makes this very sharp point. It says that this very framing, this idea that we get to just pick one off a menu, that's where the system, that's where it smuggles in its first crucial error.
So the mission for this deep dive isn't to figure out which box you or I belong in. It's to explore this really radical counterclaim from the source material.
Which is that for the vast majority of people, epistemology isn't something you choose. It's not an intellectual preference.
It's something that is structurally imposed on you.
That's the claim. We're exploring the idea that epistemology is something we are subjected to, that it's an imposed procedure, not a philosophy.
Okay, walk us through that, because that sounds, a little fatalistic. Are we saying individual critical thinking just doesn't matter for our concept of truth?
Not that it has no bearing at all, but that its influence, it just arrives far too late in the game. The core contention is that the big decisions about what's valid methodology, what's reliable evidence, even what's worth paying attention to, they're all solidified long before an individual even has the language to question them.
So if you're, say, 7 years old, sitting down for a standardized test in school.
Exactly.
The system has already decided what learning means for you. You don't get a say in that moment.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And this is the key. These decisions about knowledge, they don't show up as abstract debates in a university hall. They arrive as concrete, inescapable procedure. They're embedded in the rules of the road.
Okay, so let's look at where these imposed epistemologies actually live in the real world, because that's where this abstraction really hits home for people. The source material gives a pretty clear list of these institutional frameworks.
They're everywhere that systems need to sort and measure people. So think about diagnosis manuals. These manuals aren't just descriptive lists. They are foundational texts that enforce a very specific universalist view on the complexity of human experience.
They're setting the rules.
They're setting the rules for what counts as an illness, which means they're also defining what's normal or abnormal in the mind.
And that procedural imposition just keeps going right through our education. School assessment frameworks are a perfect example. They're a system that privileges measurement, standardization.
Right.
So if you're a student whose distress shows up as, say, test anxiety, but the school's framework only values quantifiable things like on-task behavior or your final score, the root of your problem is just procedurally ignored.
And that dismissal continues right into the professional and academic world. It defines who gets to create knowledge. We see it in research hierarchies, which consistently favor certain methodologies, randomized controlled trials, quantitative data.
Over things like qualitative research or lived experience.
Exactly. And that has a direct impact on funding models.
Oh, the funding is huge. If a major granting agency operates on the idea that only one specific type of data is rigorous, they effectively just wipe out entire lines of inquiry.
They just deny them the resources to even exist.
And then there's the clinical protocols. If you walk into any health setting, the protocols that govern your care, what they measure, what they ask, what they write in your chart, they're all procedural mandates.
They're not intellectual choices made by the individual clinician in that moment. They are standardized frameworks designed for efficiency and, for systemic categorization.
So the argument is that these institutional procedures, these manuals, these hierarchies, they act as the real philosophical gatekeepers. They shape our reality of knowledge far more powerfully than any personal belief we might hold.
Absolutely. The knowledge you're operating under is dictated by whether or not your experience fits neatly into these external procedural boxes.
And if it doesn't fit the approved questionnaire or the defined protocol,
then it's not just unhelpful to the system, it effectively doesn't exist.
And that leads us right into the heart of it, doesn't it? The real-world consequences of these imposed frameworks. Because once an institution sets up its epistemology through procedure, it has basically pre-decided 4 critical things about your reality.
This is where the power dynamics of knowledge become so clear. First, the procedure predetermines what counts as evidence. If your experience doesn't align with the approved metric, a self-report survey, a physiological measure, whatever, it's simply not counted.
It's not data.
It's not data. Second, and this is so crucial, they predetermine whose testimony is credible.
Right.
We see this through institutional power. If you're a patient, your first-hand account is often automatically filtered, it's cross-referenced, and it's potentially downgraded in favor of the clinician's notes or the lab results.
The standardized checklist score?
The checklist score. And if you happen to belong to a group that's been historically marginalized by these procedures, whether that's based on race, class, gender, your account just carries a lower procedural weight right from the start.
Because the imposed system says certain voices are just inherently less reliable. They don't conform to the norm that the system itself created.
Exactly. And the third and fourth points, when we're talking about knowing the mind, are maybe the most vital and honestly the most frightening. These systems predetermine which forms of human distress are legible.
Meaning they can be seen, named, and acted on.
Yes. And which forms of distress are just dismissed as noise.
Wow. Legible versus noise.
That distinction is the institutional mechanism of survival and, frankly, abandonment. If your suffering maps neatly onto a known diagnostic code, the system can see it. It can name it. It can fund treatment for it. It's legible.
But what if it doesn't? What if your suffering is deeply personal? Maybe it's from complex trauma that doesn't quite fit the latest diagnostic manual, or it shows up in ways that are culturally specific and not recognized.
Then the framework, by its very design, categorizes your experience as irrelevant noise. It's an artifact that needs to be filtered out because it disrupts the clean categorization, the efficient operation of the system. The distress is real to you, but it is procedurally non-existent to the institution.
So if my problem doesn't have a neat little ICD code, the system isn't just saying we can't treat it easily. It's fundamentally saying it doesn't warrant our recognition.
That's the implication.
Which makes epistemology, how we know the mind, an inherent issue of social justice. It's about systemic survival, and it's so much bigger than just an abstract philosophical debate.
It moves the entire conversation away from, universalism versus relativism to the very concrete reality of who gets help and who gets ignored while they are legitimately suffering. The imposed framework sets the boundaries for compassion.
Okay, so if that's the reality, if the common framing is a trap and epistemology is mostly imposed on us through these rigid procedures, where does Hoerricks suggest we go from here? This brings us to the alternative framework, from imposed epistemologies to situated realism.
This is the constructive part of the argument. And it's a fundamental change in the goal. The shift is about returning knowledge to its most basic grounded elements, to lived coherence, to time, relation, and survival.
So it stops looking outward for some objective, universal authority to tell us what's real.
And starts looking inward and contextually at the embodied self.
And within this shift, the author makes these very explicit claims about what is fundamentally real, completely bypassing the institutional procedures. They put forward 3 non-negotiables. First, distress is real.
That is the absolute bedrock. It doesn't matter if a system can categorize it or measure it or diagnose it. The experience of distress is a fundamental reality for the person having that experience. It's not an error in their thinking. It's a signal.
Right. The second claim, adaptation is embodied, which means how we cope and survive and learn is tied to our physical contextual existence. It's not some purely cognitive thing floating in our heads.
Our knowledge, our coping mechanisms, our understanding, it's all physically enacted.
Can you give an example of that?
Well, think of it this way. The knowledge that your neighborhood is unsafe isn't just a thought. It's physically stored in your posture, in your breathing, in your hypervigilance when you walk down the street. That is embodied adaptation.
Okay, that makes sense. And the third claim is that meaning is contextual. The interpretation of anything is tied to the specific time, place, and the web of relationships where it happens.
And that contextual piece is the very definition of situated realism. Reality is undeniably real, but our understanding of it is always filtered through a specific, non-universal position. We have to abandon the idea of a view from nowhere.
A God's eye view.
Exactly. And within this situated realism, the source material brings in the concept of gestalt knowing. This is the idea that understanding isn't achieved by breaking things down into component parts, which is what institutional procedure does.
The checklist.
The checklist. Instead, it's about perceiving the whole, the configuration, the unified structure of an experience.
So instead of a clinician or a researcher breaking down a person's experience into 5 distinct measurable symptoms, this approach asks a different question.
It asks, what is the full unified structure of this person's suffering, and what meaning emerges from that totality?
It's like the difference between listing the ingredients in a recipe
and actually tasting the finished dish.
Yeah.
The institutional procedure asks you to list the ingredients. Situated realism demands that you experience the whole thing. Knowledge is only coherent when the individual pieces come together into a meaningful whole for the person living it.
And if we connect that back to the bigger picture, it ultimately shifts the authority. It puts it back where the essay argues it belongs all along.
With the embodied lives of individuals.
That's right.
The central conclusion is that the decisions about what is real, the true epistemology that governs our daily lives and our survival, are ultimately made by those who are living them, not by external bureaucratic frameworks designed for control or for categorization.
So the ultimate authority rests with the person who is suffering and adapting, because their distress is real and their meaning is contextual. The institutions might impose their procedures for efficiency, but that procedure can't erase the fundamental reality that an individual experiences.
Situated realism prioritizes that internal, lived coherence over the external, institutional legibility.
This has been a really fascinating and I think eye-opening deep dive. We started with what seemed like a simple philosophical personality quiz, universalist, pluralist, relativist. And we landed on this pretty sobering idea that for most people, the concept of knowledge is ruthlessly imposed through these hard procedural things like diagnosis manuals and funding models.
And the takeaway for you as you're listening is the fundamental importance of understanding the infrastructure of knowledge that you're subjected to every day.
Whether you're seeking care or in education or applying for resources.
You need to recognize which systems are deciding what counts as evidence and whose testimony is seen as credible in your environment.
Because what we've discovered today is that truly knowing the mind isn't just about what you personally believe. It's about knowing who controls the procedures that define and enforce that whole structure of knowledge.
And that brings us to the final provocative thought to leave you with. If this situated realism argument is correct, if adaptation is embodied and meaning is contextual, then the systems that define knowledge are also intrinsically defining survival.
So what specific systems of knowledge imposition are you currently navigating and maybe being subjected to that might be dismissing your complex lived coherence as just organizational noise?